ourselves right now before we do anything else to just actually position ourselves to meet with God today instead of just hear about him. If you're comfortable, just put your hands in some kind of posture to say you're open, and let's pray. God, we've got a few minutes left in this service, and we do desire to meet with you. And I'm just thankful that it's not my zealousness that causes you to want to meet with me, that it's your nature that you desire to meet with us. So tune our attention now to you. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, my name's DJ. It's great to be with you. Thanks for joining us on this wonderful Wednesday. A couple quick announcements. So in 2 weeks, we're going to be doing church in the park. Just a great way to mix it up, spend some community time. Still 6:30, just 2 blocks that way at Buckley Park. And one thing you got to know is bring an instrument if you've got one that you play, because we've been sending out the music sheets of the songs that we're going to be playing, and it's just sort of like a come one, come all. We're going to sit in a big circle. Well, not quite like that. You guys are looking at me like I'm crazy. We're just mixing it up a little bit, changing a little bit. Bring an instrument. We're going to do church kind of as normal, 3 songs there and a little sermon, but we'll be out and about. Amy, you going to bring a tambourine or a shaker or something? Yeah. No. Okay, well, bring something. And afterwards, we're going to walk to Cold Stone, and that is on us. So just a community night in 2 weeks. The second thing I wanted to say is if you're new here or if you're just getting to know us, one thing that you can do is text welcome to the number that I think we have that on the screen. That's the Vineyard number. And if you text that, it'll allow us to have your contact information, or you can give that if you would like to. It lets us tell you what's going on and also gives us an easy way to communicate with you, because a church is really a family. Now, how do you do that when you come and attend something that you watch? Well, we just take the steps we can to get to know each other, and that's a really practical one. So speaking of our church, this is the last thing I wanted to say. You might, I don't know, especially those of you who have been with us for a while, might be wondering about the status of this building. We have, for the last 9 months, I guess, I just counted today, been in this facility. And we currently share this facility with the church that actually owns the facility. And it's been a really cool partnership because they just had gotten to the place where the maintenance was overwhelming for them. This building is technically 130 years old, but there was a church here before that burned down. So I like to say 141 years old. It's an old building, and one of the first buildings, period, in Durango. And you can imagine the things that come with a massively old building. And frankly, the reality is it's not really set up to do church the way modern church is done. But we needed a facility, and they needed some help. So for the last 9 months, we've been in this facility, but at the same time asking the Lord, is this what you want for us longer term? AKA a huge investment that it would take to kind of make this thing suit our needs and the needs of our community moving forward. It's literally been about 70 years since there's been any major maintenance on this building. And if you walked up today and looked at the sidewalk, you'll see half of the roof on the sidewalk right now. So anyway, I just bring this up because we've been talking with the other church, negotiating, and just talking about what is our future. And I'd ask for your prayers because we've decided we're going to decide a direction by August 1st. And so that's coming up pretty quick. And we just want the Lord's favor, his direction and guidance on whatever we would do with the future of this thing. So we know the church is not a building, but man, it sure helps to have a place to meet, doesn't it? And so also, if you have any advice or wisdom on this subject, I'm totally open to it. So you can come talk to me along the way, or I just would love to give you an update on the process. But that's where we are, and we're excited about where this church is going. So this week we're starting a new series called Bring Your Shovel. It comes from that quippy saying, well, I don't know if it's a quippy saying, Jesus said it, But if you have faith, you can move mountains. Do you remember that one? Actually, I'll read it to you. This comes from Matthew 17. The disciples were asking Jesus, why couldn't we kick the demon out of this guy? And he said this, you don't have enough faith. I tell you the truth, if you had faith as small as a mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, move from here, and it would move. Nothing would be impossible. Now, this feels like one of those Jesus sayings, doesn't it? Like, how many of you have actually asked a mountain to move? And, Jesus always talked like that. And in a way that you're like, is that really possible? And yet it draws at our attention somehow, doesn't it? Well, the saying for this series is sort of our rendition of the reality of this faith to move mountains. And that is, Jesus does move mountains in our lives, but we better bring a shovel. For the next 9 weeks, we're going to be looking at the life of Jesus, and at the same time, looking at it from the perspective of how can we partner with Jesus in what he wants to do in our life. So for me in preparing this series, here's how I'm personally approaching it. At the beginning of the year, I spent some time reflecting on 2021 and looking ahead to 22. And I noticed that I was just tired, a little cynical, a little burned out, and a little frustrated. And as I found myself journaling through what I was feeling before God, I just kept sensing that so I'm about to turn 40. There's things in my life as a 40-year-old that I thought I would have gotten rid of by now. And also just, I don't know if this is midlife or what, but just kind of a blahness of like, is this what this thing is about? It's starting to feel repetitive. And it's starting to feel like it's not working. And that youthful zeal, like anything can happen, is starting to go by the wayside. And I find myself just wanting to show up, And so as I was praying through that, I felt like the Lord gave me a word that was really a strange word. And I like to have a word of the year to kind of focus on. And this was my word of the year, exit. Exit is kind of a strange thing to focus on, but I felt like I needed to exit the patterns that I'd built over 39 years of my life. Almost like the boredom that I'd got stuck in didn't match with what I feel like Jesus could do in my life. And yet I find myself unable to sort of reconcile those differences and a little bit more tired. And so I felt like the Lord gave me this word, and that's kind of what I've been focusing on this year. How do I exit? How do I step out of just doing what I'm supposed to do? I don't know, maybe you can relate in some kind of a way. The interesting thing about exiting is you have to re-enter in some way. Eventually, if you stop doing stuff, you're not doing anything. And I've kind of gotten to the place where I've been very intrigued lately at re-looking at Jesus' life from the perspective of, if I started from a blank slate, what would it look like to adopt his ways of living? What would it look like to take on his idea of what a human is supposed to be? And so I found myself hungry, actually. And as we've approached this series, that's really what I'm looking at personally. I'm looking at Jesus as the archetype. When I read the stories, I'm like, how does this actually work for myself? Here's a couple examples of the practical questions around the theme of exit that I've been asking this year. One is, I value faithfulness, but I'm constantly chained to fruitfulness. In other words, I find myself measuring the thing I don't want to be. Does that make sense? Constantly looking at, how am I doing, growing, perceiving myself? Am I the man I want to be? And I'm holding myself to the standard that actually, if I could just sort of speak to my little soul, I would say, just chill out and live and give yourself grace and give other people grace. I'm trying to figure out how to exit that. Another one is, I value peace and contentment. I really do. I want to wake up in the morning. I mean, this is how I envision a perfect day. I wake up slowly, and I sit on the front porch with a cup of coffee, and I just enjoy what's around me. But here's what my brain does. I wake up with a massive to-do list, and energy to go accomplish everything. And instead of peace and contentment, I find myself discontent and anxious. How does that reconcile, and why am I still doing this at 40? Here's a third one. I recognize that I'm easily discouraged by things that are outside of my control, namely people. I can't make anybody do anything, and yet it still seems to control so much of how I feel about my life. I'm just sick of it. I want to be different. Okay, what about you? As we approach this series, I'm going to call these things mountains. We could call them whatever, but for the sake of our talk today, consider the things that you would like to see changed in your life mountains. And if you can articulate those, would you be willing to take the risk, the faith risk, that maybe God could change those things in your life as we look at the life of Jesus? In some ways, I feel like that's a big ask, right? And in other ways, I feel like some of you are like, duh, that's what we're supposed to be doing here, But we're kind of in that place, right? Where are we willing to bring our whole selves to the table and let God change us? I'll tell you the truth. If we want to see these mountains move, we have to bring our shovel. It's going to take some work. The way it was described as I was preparing for this, that I just have connected to, the movie or series, The Chosen, which is about Jesus' life. I didn't actually see this, but somebody described a scene where one of the followers of Jesus wakes up sleeping in a tent, literally following Jesus, sort of gets up out of the tent and is just like got a crick in their neck and they're rubbing the crick. And the other follower of Jesus says, yeah, it's pretty rough, isn't it? And then says something like, you'll get used to it. Well, maybe you won't. And that's kind of the idea. When we think about following Jesus, we think of it in spiritual terms in the 21st century. But in the first century, these people were going and sleeping and eating or not eating whenever Jesus did. There was a shovelness to it, if you will. So that's how we're going to approach our series. Today, we're going to look at a couple stories that illustrate freedom, sort of. That's our topic, freedom, sort of. Except for I couldn't call it that because that just seemed like a terrible title. So it's freedom. All right, so here's how we get there today. As we look at the life of Jesus, we're going to be reading through the book of Mark. And we're not going to do it chronologically like you would normally do it, verse by verse. We're going to look at sections that illustrate topics and points. And we're going to do this for the next 9 weeks. In the same way, I'd encourage you to start reading the book of Mark. If what I talked about today stirred you in some way, if you feel like you could use a new vision of what a human is supposed to be, if something grabbed you in terms of a mountain in your life that you would like to see moved, then I would encourage you, take up the first practice of just reading through Mark over and over and looking at the life of Jesus, trying to imagine yourself in the story. And one of the things you'll find at the very beginning is Jesus is quoting the book of Isaiah quite a bit. He comes to age and he's ready to lead his ministry, and he goes to an Old Testament prophecy and he identifies himself as the fulfillment of this Old Testament prophet. And without going into all the details, what I've got to say about Isaiah is that it's a book or a prophet speaking to Israel, the people of God, about two things. One is judgment, and one is the rescue of God that is sure to come. The first 39 chapters are mostly about the judgment that is going to come through their exile. In other words, another country coming in and taking them over. But the next chapters, 39 through, 66, I think. Is that right? So those chapters are all about how God is not going to give up on them, and he is going to come and redeem and restore them. And so when Jesus shows up on the scene, where do you think he starts quoting? In chapter 40, right at the beginning of that. And he says, I am the fulfillment of what that prophet said. And what did that prophet say about God, what God was going to do? Well, here's what Jesus says. This comes out of Luke 4, 17 through 19. The story is he's in his hometown. They're in the synagogue. So it's a Saturday because their Sabbath was a Saturday. And so everyone has gathered and Jesus stands up to give the message. And it says the scroll of Isaiah the prophet was handed to him. He unrolled the scroll, found the place where it was written. And he read this. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim that the captives will be released, and the blind will see, and the oppressed will be set free, and that the time of the Lord's favor has come. What is this prophecy all about? Freedom, sort of. It's about people who are chained, maybe people like you and me, stuck in certain kinds of ways of life, finding themselves oppressed in some way. In many ways, this is a bigger story, right? It's a story about a people that were oppressed. But Jesus says, I have come to find those people who are captive and set them free. Now, the word freedom is a state of exemption from the power or control of another. I like that definition because it helps me feel like something just got off my shoulders. Let me read it to you again. A state of exemption from the power or control of another or of a being or of something. You ever felt like that? Like you have freedom from something that is weighing you down specifically? In my case, the things that weigh me down the most are things that are intangible, right? They're almost things in my heart and head. But that's not true for everybody. I mean, some people, the things that are weighing you down are physical. They're situational. They're chemical. I mean, there's so many things that weigh us down as humans. And one thing that I think is so interesting about this passage and the fundamental view from Isaiah is that they didn't have the same view of heaven and hell that I think we do today. This idea that we need God to rescue us from our life and take us somewhere. They had this belief that God was actually going to come to them and make the world right again. That's what they were longing for. The Jews, they weren't trying to get out of this life. They were trying to figure out when was the Messiah going to come to them and restore the world the way it was intended to be. And so this is huge because it sets up the idea that God cares about us enough to come to our world, not just wait up in his world until we sort of get there if we have the right kind of fire insurance. This kind of way of thinking is holistic. And that's why the Jews believed in peace or shalom, which was holistic interwovenness. They wanted to see all of the world restored, all of the things that stress us out made right, all of the people that were poor and oppressed be brought into right standing and right place in our systems that we live within. They wanted to see the world taken care of, the earth, the physical earth taken care of. They wanted to see a place that was alive and flourishing. And so when Jesus came, by the way, they thought that Messiah was going to come with a spear and a sword to make that happen. When Jesus came and he claimed, this is what I've come to do, to bring freedom, he was inviting them to experience something in their life now. The correlation is that as you guys are here watching a service, watching me talk at you, it's so much more than just listening to something. It's about becoming something. Today, the fact that we have maybe the opportunity to take a step in partnership with God that might change how we experience the world forever. There's 3 stories that stuck out to me that illustrate this. And so I just want to read them quickly to you. I'll probably ask more questions than give answers. But I like these stories because they're all found at the beginning of Mark. They're all related to religiosity and freedom. And they all happen to happen on the Sabbath. Let's read them together, meaning you can follow along on the screen. You don't have to read out loud with me. All right. Jesus and his companions went to the town of Capernaum. When the Sabbath day came, he went to the synagogue and began to teach. People were amazed at his teaching, for he taught with real authority, quite unlike the religious teachers of the law. This is where the story gets interesting. Suddenly, a man in the synagogue who was possessed by an evil spirit cried out, "Why are you interfering with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus reprimanded him. "Be quiet, come out of the man," he ordered. And at that, the evil spirit screamed, threw the man into a convulsion, and then came out of him. As you can imagine, amazement gripped the audience, and they began to discuss what had happened. Listen to this. "What sort of new teaching is this?" they asked excitedly. "It has such authority. Even the evil spirits obey his orders." The news about Jesus quickly spread throughout the entire region of Galilee. Okay, this is a great lead off to Jesus because he's not doing what we're doing here. I just hate to say that, but it's just so true. His practice and his teaching were absolutely aligned. And that was, can you imagine this happening right now? In our moment right now? We'd be so weirded out, wouldn't we? You'd mark that on your list of a church not to attend again. But there was something in this that people were hungry for, and that was not just more religious speak. Here's a guy who functions within the teaching that he teaches. In other words, he talks about it and he lived it. And those things are so in alignment that I find myself wanting to become whole and healed when I'm in the presence of his teaching. So he had authority to speak into their life, but then he actually, he got in the dirt with them. And I think this is this is actually, I think, what we long for church to be, isn't it? We want to be changed and different. But then there's this other juxtaposition of how uncomfortable that is. If we just had a time right now where I said, all right, shout out your needs before this community and before God, and we'll pray for them, right? It would just start to feel like, I don't want to be exposed in that way. I don't want to bring myself in that way before these people. But Jesus was so holistic in his approach to the human heart that he almost demanded it. Maybe we could say he just invited it or he drew that out. But whatever you would say, when people heard Jesus speak, they just found themselves on the edge of their seat. But not just because I've intellectually learned something. Their hearts were leaping out and saying, this is what I've been hungry for. I've needed to hear this. I've needed to change in this way. Isn't this a great example of the mountains and the shovel? Right? Because we want our mountains to be moved. We recognize we have mountains. I know I'm not preaching the choir when I talk about my needs. And I know each of us have needs. Those are our mountains. But it takes a presence to draw us out, to sort of be in that moment where we see those mountains happen, right? Another way we could say this is Jesus is in alignment, meaning his body or his invitation represented what he believed to be true about the world. And that caused an incredible kind of human. This is the first thing that I want to point out. I guess it's twofold. One is your needs matter to God. They absolutely do. The things that maybe have been trivialized in your life in any number of ways, those matter here. They matter before God. And they matter in this community and in our church. And frankly, if we're not seeing healing and transformation in those things, we're missing what it means to follow Jesus. That doesn't mean I know how to formalize it, all right? It doesn't mean I'm like, okay, and now we're just going to do that, because it's not that simple, but that is what this is about. The other side of that is when we live in alignment like Jesus did, we draw people out. We draw them to their sort of vulnerable and humble selves, but that is where we become human healers. That is where we become sort of pass through, like the divine nature of God comes through us, and we are able to, through compassion, care for and meet people in a way that brings freedom in their life. And if we're not doing that as a community, again, I would say we're missing the mark of what the intended human journey is all about. Certainly missing the mark of being people who say, we follow Jesus. And so we're going to get on with that, I guess. I don't know. We're going to talk about it at least, and I would love to see us keep taking steps in this direction. One just practical way I thought of this, Kinley, who is just an incredible servant at the church. I don't know if you know Kinley, but he's a quiet guy. He's a soft-spoken guy, but he's the guy that sets out the signs and tears them down every week. He comes early to help set up the stage and make sure all the details are done, like the coffee over there. He does this every week as a volunteer because he loves to serve. And the first week that we had him lead our pre-service huddle, which is a prayer time we do at 6 o'clock, I had led it before, and I had always been like, all right, guys, here's what we're doing at service today. All right, let's pray. The first thing Kinley did just put me to shame. He said, all right, guys, does anybody have any needs today? Can I pray for any of you? I was just humiliated with the fact that I get so busy doing church that I forget that we're here for each other. And Kinley saw it right away. And now he started leading our prayer teams in that way. It's like a practical example of how somebody, when they become in alignment with the teaching and practice of their life, they just start to embody something that is different, that is like Jesus. That's our goal. All right, the second story, another Sabbath story, is this one, just a few verses later. One Sabbath day, as Jesus was walking through some grain fields, his disciples began breaking off heads of grain to eat. But the Pharisees said to Jesus, look, why are they breaking the law by harvesting grain in the Sabbath? Well, Jesus said to them, haven't you ever read the scriptures? What David did when he and his companions were hungry? We just went through a series where we actually touched on this story in the Bible. David went into the house of God during the days of Abiathar, the high priest, and he broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests were allowed to eat. He also gave some to his companions. Then Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people, and not people meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. All right, this is the second story that I can imagine would have been incredibly challenging for the Jews. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that Jesus did that just absolutely irked them, like stuck a knife in their side and twisted it. I mean, it just would have made them so mad. Let me explain why in a very brief way. The Jews, over the long haul, had been people who had made a covenant to God, and their goal was to be faithful to God. And over, they missed the mark on that. Over and over, they ended up doing things that God had asked them not to, maybe much like you and I in our life. I mean, they were just sort of pretty bad followers of God. And so they find themselves in all kinds of wavering situations. And so what the religious people ended up doing is they started latching and ratcheting down on the religious practices and saying, look, you crazy wayward people, you've got to bring your life into alignment with what God has asked us to do. The first way and the easiest way was the Sabbath, because it was just one day taking off. And so the Sabbath for the Jews became almost like a centerpiece of religion for them. The idea was we can make you not work on Saturday, which was the Sabbath, and in this way we can make God come back and fulfill his covenant. We will work really hard at being good, and he will respond to us by coming and blessing us. There's Kinley. I just told a story about you. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. So, squirrel. So the Jews, and especially the religious people, had turned following the Sabbath into a law, like into a literal law where you could get in massive trouble with the government for breaking it. So here's Jesus, a guy that claims to be with God, and willy-nilly, he's eating on the Sabbath, and then he says this incredibly sacrilegious phrase. The Sabbath is not to, the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of the people, not for the people to meet the needs of the requirements of the Sabbath. I mean, for them, like in terms of contrast for here, that would be me like saying to you guys, hey, it doesn't really matter if you come to church. Like, just come whenever you want to come, you know? And it's okay. It's just, it's for you. It's like me saying, like, it's your me time, you know? And maybe that doesn't sound that crazy to you, but if you're a pastor, that sounds crazy because you got to keep the flock all in shape and you got to keep everybody going, right? The kind of freedom here is almost confusing. Really? Spiritual practices are meant to serve our needs? I thought I was this bad human that had to get my life into shape and start being more moral. Today on the way here, Lucy, my 9-year-old, asked me, what are you preaching on? And I said, Jesus. And she said, Dad. I'm like, no, I really am. And then I said, well, actually, freedom. I'm talking about freedom. And I said, do you know what that means? And she said, like we probably would all say, freedom is getting to do whatever you want. And I just sort of have to pose that question to us. Does God want us to do whatever we want? Is that what Jesus is saying here? Is he saying like, look, it doesn't matter what the religious rules of the day are. You get to do whatever you want because God has given you freedom. And to that I would say, if you have the freedom to cross the road in front of a truck, would you want to do that? You guys are not very responsive. You're thinking about it. Okay, semi coming, I could cross, I have the freedom to do it, but I don't know. It's like a trick question, right? It's church. Of course, it's a trick question. Yeah. Did I hit you? Oh, okay. Oh, I get it. He got hit by a car. Okay, so anyway, the point of this is that freedom unto what? Have you ever thought that our freedom gives us the opportunity to do whatever we would like in terms of being a human? But freedom doesn't actually dictate what we should do, or even what would fulfill our longings to do. It just says that we have access to do it. Now, there's lots of questions that arise here, but one thing, circling back to our theme, we have to see here is that Jesus has entrusted us with agency, with the ability to create and co-create, I guess you could say, with him, our life. And so when it comes to this series and the fact that God might want to move mountains in our life, we sort of get to decide, do I want to do this? This almost feels like a strange question in church. Why would you ask me what I want to do? This isn't about me. This is about what God has told me to do. And I would say Jesus is actually constantly asking people, what do you want? Who do you want to be? I think God put something deep, deep within us. And when Jesus came, he was more interested in stirring what was in us than telling us what we should be. All right, the last story. This comes just a few verses later in Mark 3, another Sabbath story. Jesus went to the synagogue again and noticed a man with a deformed hand. Since it was the Sabbath, Jesus' enemies watched him closely. They are just setting a trap for him. He is too much for them. His comments about the Sabbath and all this freedom, they're messing with their laws, Like they gotta rein these people back in. And so if he healed one's, so Jesus' enemies watched him closely. If he healed the man's hand, they planned to accuse him of working on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the deformed hand, "Come and stand in front of everyone." I cannot believe Jesus did this. I mean, again, remember how we said Jesus' teaching and his function were aligned? Orthodoxy, orthopraxy. He was aligning himself to the point that he was willing to invite somebody up and use them as an object lesson. I'm just not bold enough to do that. But I wonder, maybe that's the Jesus way. I don't know. Does somebody want to come up here with your issue? And me say, anyway, I just wanted you to feel what that would feel like for them, okay? All right, good, I think you got it. And then he turned to his critics and he asked, "Does the law permit good deeds on the Sabbath, or is it a day for doing evil?" It's hard to answer that, right? It's kind of like obvious. Is this a day to save a life or destroy it? Again, we're in church. Jesus, But they wouldn't answer him. He looked around at them angrily and was deeply saddened by their hard hearts. And then he said to the man, "Hold out your hand." So the man held out his hand and it was restored. And at once the Pharisees went away and met with the supporters of Herod to plot how to kill Jesus. I think this is such, again, a great section about freedom, because here we are on the Sabbath. And even though they are gathering before God in a sacred environment, just like we are, they're doing the right ritual. They want nothing to do with Jesus messing with the system, to the point that they genuinely don't want to see somebody healed in their midst, because that would somehow be work. I think what Jesus is pointing out here through freedom, and this, I just see this in my own life, and I think I see it in all of ours. Freedom exposes what our hearts actually care about. When you look at your life, when you look at your time, when you look at your money, when you look at how you interact with people, when you just do an honest evaluation of how you and I use our freedom, it does one thing: makes it glaringly obvious what we care about. If we find ourselves never taking a risk, then we probably care about our image a lot. If we find ourselves constantly being in control, then we probably value managing our fear in some kind of way. There's just all kinds of ways to expose yourself when you look at your life and what you would do with your freedom. Isn't it interesting that instead of trying to make us do things, Jesus wanted us to see our hearts? He wanted the Pharisees to see their hearts. He wanted them to be confronted with the mountains in their life, so that they could be in a place of asking this, I think, crazy valuable question, which is, do I actually want to see God change me in any way? Do I actually want to see God come and make earth the way he wants to in any way? Right? It's almost easier to just be on our religious soapboxes, telling everybody how to act and what to do and cheering our wins, rather than being in that malleable place of addressing, do we want to see God change us from the inside out? Do we want to become the humans that God intended for us to be? And so what does God do with his freedom? Well, he comes and dies for us. What? He came and died for you. That's what God did with his freedom. I'm convinced he could have solved the law requirements of sin in other ways. We could debate on that theologically. I'm just convinced God's big enough to be God. He could wave a magic wand if he wanted to. He could do all kinds of things to convince you and I that we are free and that we could join him in heaven. But what he chose to do with his freedom was come and serve, live as a human, teach the way of God and his kingdom, and eventually be killed for it. And then he tells his disciples, right before he goes to be killed, remember this moment as we eat bread and drink wine. Remember this, because it's only going to dawn on you as we go through life longer, how much I love you. You know, the interesting thing about Jesus is he doesn't demand anything from us. Instead, he tries to win our hearts. And that's how we'll close our service. We're going to take communion. And communion is the practice that Christians have been doing for 2,000 years. It's essentially a meal, bread and wine. And yet it's done with an intention towards what Christ has done for us. And so as we go to take these elements, I want you to start thinking about two things for your life. The first question is, God, what did you do with your freedom? And the second is, what might I do with my freedom? For this group of the audience, you can kind of from the front to the back file out and circle around and grab the elements. We'll take them together in a second. And the same is true for you guys, except for your elements are over there. And I'll dismiss you now. I think it's powerful to look at our life in terms of comparing ourselves to Jesus because it shows us the capability of the human spirit. It shows us what God intended. The scripture describes Jesus as the fulfilled Adam, which means Adam and Eve, but kind of the human that came and lived in the fullness. And so it's helpful to look at his life, but if we just look at his life from the perspective of I need to be like that, we will constantly feel like we fall short. And that's why it needs to be balanced with us looking at Jesus' life from the perspective of what does this say about how God feels about me? And the truth is, Jesus came to this earth to die a brutal death so that you and I could find true freedom from our sin. And so as we take this today, what I want to encourage you to do is fix your eyes on the God that loves you. He believes in you. Whatever word you need to attach there, to remember that he did this for you and me. Right in the middle of our stuff. Regardless of where we are, he did this for you and me. 1 Corinthians 11:23 says, "For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night that he was betrayed, took the bread, and when he'd given his thanks, he broke it and said,